Ever wondered what it really takes to shut down power-hungry bullies? Picture this. The HOA's very own Karen and her little police squad pounding on your door, barking orders like they own the land, only to be standing there speechless minutes later when they find out you own the entire valley. The trick: smart planning, a dose of boldness, and a rock-solid understanding of your legal rights. Once you truly grasp the value of what's yours, nobody dares to cross you. This wild tale will show exactly how I earned the respect of an entire valley, turning arrogant troublemakers into the punchline of the joke. You can stand your ground the same way I protect your property, stay unshaken against any threat, and silence any Karen before she even gets started. Here's the real secret to winning every confrontation. The morning mist still hugged the slopes of Soma Hills when I heard the crunch of gravel in my driveway. For 3 peaceful months, I'd been enjoying quiet mornings at my grandmother's old vineyard until now. Peeking through the kitchen window of the farmhouse I'd been slowly renovating since inheriting it, I saw a spotless white BMW SUV roll in like it owned the road. Out stepped a sharply dressed woman in an expensive charcoal suit, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it could have cut glass. 2 younger assistants followed, each in matching polo shirts, clipboards in hand as if heading into battle. Her high heels tapped against the gravel with perfect precision, announcing her presence with every step. I knew exactly who she was before she even spoke. Veronica Slate, self-crowned queen of the newly built Silvercrest Hills HOA, and, if the local rumors were true, a former bankruptcy lawyer who now specialized in turning farmland into glossy luxury developments. I stepped outside in my work clothes, coffee mug still in hand, watching as she surveyed my land like it was a problem to be fixed. "Mr. Vale, I presume," she said without waiting for confirmation. "I'm Veronica Slate, president of the Silvercrest Hills Homeowners Association. We need to talk about some serious violations." Her assistants flanked her like bodyguards, one already snapping photos of my grandfather's old John Deere tractor, the same one I'd been using to clear overgrown brush by the main road. It wasn't exactly showroom pretty, but it ran flawlessly and had been part of this vineyard longer than any house in her so-called upscale community. "That I saw," she said, pointing with a perfectly manicured finger, "is a direct breach of our community's visual standards. It's ruining the harmony we've worked hard to establish here." I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the absurdity sink in. She was in designer heels, standing ankle-deep in mud, surrounded by the smell of damp earth and compost, lecturing me on visual harmony. "Ma'am," I replied evenly, "this is private property. My family's owned it for 3 generations. I'm not sure what authority you believe you have here, but I'd like to see your paperwork." Her polite smile didn't fade, but I saw a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Mr. Vale, you seem confused. The HOA has an expanded jurisdiction agreement with the county. That means we now regulate property standards across this entire agricultural corridor, which includes your little farm." She waved toward my 70 acres of organic grapevines as if calling it little would make it less valuable. That's when I noticed something. Neither she nor her clipboard crew had shown me a single official document, permit, or even proper ID, just her business card. "I'll need to see this jurisdiction agreement," I said, pulling out my phone and hitting record. "And I'd like identification from your inspectors as well." The young man with the camera shifted uncomfortably while the woman with the clipboard leaned in to whisper something to Veronica. Her smile grew tighter. "Mr. Vale, you don't understand the position you're in. I've personally overseen the redevelopment of a dozen agricultural properties in this county. I know exactly which legal tools to use, and I'm giving you the chance to cooperate voluntarily. Trust me, or you don't want to see what happens when we escalate." I slipped my hand into my shirt pocket and pulled out my grandmother Margaret's old leather portfolio. Inside were the documents I'd been studying since she passed her papers that spelled out exactly what she had left me. "Before you make more threats, Mrs. Slate," I said, You should know my grandmother left me some very specific water rights in her will. Ancient ones. Fully protected. And they run through this entire valley. Her confident stance wavered ever so slightly, the look of someone who realizes they might have overlooked something big. Her assistants exchanged glances, the cameraman lowering his lens. Water rights? She repeated, her tone losing some of its earlier force. That's not relevant to landscaping compliance. But I could tell she was already calculating and mentally running through legal scenarios like only a former bankruptcy lawyer could. Oh, it's very relevant, I said, closing the portfolio but keeping it in plain sight. Any major development that affects a watershed or agricultural preservation zone has to account for existing water rights. And these rights, according to my documents, extend far beyond my property lines. I gestured toward the rolling hills where her perfect lawns and ornamental fountains stood. I'm sure a lawyer like yourself knows exactly how messy water law can get in California. That landed. Her jaw tightened, and for the first time since stepping out of her BMW, Veronica Slate looked a broken bar uncertain. Veronica adjusted her suit jacket, trying to reclaim her composure. This isn't finished, Mr. Vale, she said crisply, signaling her entourage. You'll be getting a formal violation notice soon enough. The HOA takes community standards very seriously. Her heels clicked against the gravel as she headed back to the BMW, though her stride carried less authority than when she arrived. She turned for one last jab. And those water rights you're so proud of? They won't mean much if the county decides your operation is a public nuisance. I stood there watching as their SUV disappeared down the drive, a trail of dust settling over my grandmother's cherished rose bushes. A slow smile crept onto my face. Veronica believed she was dealing with a clueless farmer as someone easy to push into selling. She had no idea the storm she'd just stepped into. True to her word, the official violation notice came by certified mail, delivered like a legal death warrant. And that was just the opening move. Within hours of signing for it, my phone lit up with neighbor complaints, and the Silvercrest Hills Facebook group exploded with posts warning about dangerous chemicals at the old vineyard. The accusations were dressed up as concerned community chatter, whispers about mysterious spraying and potential groundwater contamination. In reality, the only substances I'd used were organic fertilizers and occasional neem oil for pests. But accuracy wasn't the goal here. This was psychological warfare, and Veronica was using my neighbors as her unwitting foot soldiers. Then came the real showstopper, an anonymously posted video in 3 different neighborhood groups. It featured a man in a high-visibility vest inspecting my wine storage barn, with a narrator solemnly pointing out supposed fire hazards and unsafe chemical storage. The camera panned dramatically over electrical panels and wine barrels lit to look menacing. The production quality was too high for some casual neighbor gripe. Halfway through my second viewing, I realized what I was looking at. A staged hit piece dressed up like an official safety inspection. The timing was perfect, posted right as people were settling in for the evening, scrolling through social media with a glass of wine in hand. But Veronica had slipped. On my third watch, I caught something the editor had missed. At about the 2-minute mark, while the inspector talked about fire hazards, a faint woman's voice in the background said, "Make sure you get a close-up of those electrical boxes." Then came, "Perfect, Marcus. Now, let's do the chemical storage angle." The original audio had been poorly muted, and there it was, a proof this was a production, not an inspection. I saved the video, silently thanking Marcus for forgetting to turn off his mic. That's when Sophie arrived, my 26-year-old niece, fresh from Stanford Law School and badly in need of a break. Her old Honda Civic rattled up the drive just as I hung up from my third concerned neighbor call of the day. "Uncle Ethan," she said, tossing her duffel bag onto the porch and hugging me, smelling faintly of caffeine and study stress. "What's this I hear about you starting a neighborhood war?" I showed her the Facebook posts and the video. She replayed it on her laptop, her eyes narrowing with the sharp focus of a lawyer in training. "This is calculated. she said. Whoever did this knows exactly how to stir up a community without stepping into outright defamation. Then she noticed something I'd missed. Look here, she said, pointing at a timestamp on the post. The upload time says late afternoon. But the shadows in this footage, that's morning light or probably mid-morning. And this electrical panel they're calling dangerous, it's not even live. The conduit ends in the middle of nowhere. We spent the next hour dissecting the footage frame by frame, building a list of continuity errors and inconsistencies. The so-called inspector was reading from a script, pointing out dangers that didn't exist on equipment that wasn't even functional. The following day brought a new kind of attacker, this time hitting directly at the heart of my family's livelihood. A certified letter from my bank stated that the agricultural loan my grandmother had taken to upgrade the vineyard's irrigation system was now 2 months overdue. I had 30 days to pay $80,000 in full, or foreclosure proceedings would begin. I'd been so focused on restoring the farmhouse and replanting damaged vines that I'd neglected the financial paperwork. Holding that letter at the kitchen table, staring out over 70 acres of prime Sonoma vineyard, the weight of 3 generations pressed on my shoulders. For the first time since inheriting the land, Veronica's unspoken offer flashed through my mind: a sell out, clear the debt, and let someone else deal with HOA politics and farming headaches. It would be so easy to walk away, buy a small condo somewhere, and let her turn this valley into another soulless development. But easy wasn't what my grandmother raised me for. I must have looked ready to give up, because Sophie caught me staring at the bank letter over my 3rd cup of coffee. Uncle Ethan, she said firmly, if you let some hoe bully drive you off land Grandma Margaret's protected since 1952, she'd haunt this place forever. She was right. Of course, knowing that in my head was one thing and feeling it in my gut was another. Sophie, I'm not a farmer, I admitted. I'm a retired aerospace engineer who thought it might be nice to make wine and grow vegetables. I have no idea how to fight legal battles against people who do this for a living. That's when Sophie made up her mind. Then it's a good thing I'm taking a semester off, she declared, as if the decision had been in her back pocket all along. I was going to tell you anyway, I need a break from a law school, and you need someone who actually understands these legal games. She was already pulling out her laptop, typing with the laser focus that had gotten her into Stanford. Besides, she added, I've been dying for a real-world case to test all this property law I've been studying. And Uncle Ethano, after watching that video, I'm convinced this is about a lot more than some hoe aesthetic complaint. Almost on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Hoe meeting tomorrow night at the community center. Formal liens and violation penalties will be discussed. Attendance strongly recommended. A versus. Veronica Slate was turning up the heat, and this time, she wasn't coming alone. The Silvercrest Hills Community Center had that bland corporate meeting smell, part burnt coffee, part industrial carpet, the kind that makes every conversation feel heavier than it needs to be. By the time the meeting started, nearly 50 residents had crammed into a room built for 30. Folding chairs squeezed between fake plants and posters preaching community unity. I arrived with Sophie, her bag stuffed with legal printouts on hoe statutes and California agricultural protections. At the front, Veronica presided behind a folding table littered with official-looking paperwork. Beside her sat a thin man in an expensive suit who kept checking his Rolex like his real appointment was somewhere else. He introduced himself as David Mackenzie, an attorney specializing in hoe compliance and enforcement. His voice was polished, confident, the kind that makes complicated legal threats sound almost reasonable. What we're dealing with here, Mackenzie began, clicking through a PowerPoint that somehow made my grandfather's tractor look like industrial pollution, is a clear violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions governing this entire agricultural corridor. A map popped up, showing the Silvercrest Hills development and nearby properties, including mine, all shaded in regulatory red. For 20 minutes, I listened to talk of liens, penalties, and something called an abatement order before he dropped the real punchline: the hoe is prepared to place a $50,000 lien on the Vale property, plus $500 per day until compliance is achieved. Furthermore, we will recommend that the county issue an abatement order requiring the immediate removal of all non-conforming agricultural equipment. Pens scratched, heads nodded. People looked at me like this was all perfectly reasonable. I stood slowly, pulling my grandmother's leather portfolio from under my arm. "Mr. Mackenzie," I said, "before you start talking about lions, there's something you and Mrs. Slate should probably be aware of." All eyes turned my way. Veronica's smile tightened as I opened the portfolio and produced a document stamped with an official federal seal. "This," I announced, "is a certificate of designated agricultural preservation zone, issued by the National Association of Wine Growers in partnership with the U.S. Department of Agriculture." The letterhead gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the government stamps bold and undeniable. My family's vineyard is a federally recognized protected organic growing region. That means federal agricultural preservation laws apply here. The silence was priceless. Mackenzie's polished confidence cracked for just a moment, while Veronica leaned forward like she could somehow read the fine print from across the room. "What this means," I continued, savoring the moment, "is that any development that could alter soil composition, impact the water table, or threaten our organic certification must undergo a federal environmental review. And so that includes residential projects with decorative fountains, chemical lawn treatments, and non-agricultural road work." Through the window, the lights of Silvercrest Hills glittered in the distance, as if waiting to be reminded who really held the power in this valley. The construction dispute hung in the air, and I had to admit Mackenzie recovered faster than I expected. "Mr. Vale," he began smoothly, "federal agricultural designations may be significant, but they don't override local zoning laws or HOA covenant enforcement." His voice took on that condescending rhythm lawyers get when they assume they're talking to someone out of their depth. "The violations we've recorded deal with community standards and aesthetics, not farming practices." Even so, I caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. This wasn't the neat, cut-and-dry HOA case he probably handled on autopilot. The federal documents I carried weren't the kind of obstacle he could sweep aside with a standard speech. That's when Sophie stood, timing her move perfectly. Her training in law shone through in her posture and tone. "Mr. Mackenzie, you might want to refresh your memory on the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution, specifically regarding federal agricultural statutes," she said, her voice laced with enough authority to make him hesitate. "When local rules clash with federal environmental protections, federal law takes precedence. And for the record, organic certification rules explicitly forbid the types of chemical treatments HOAs typically require for landscaping." She opened her laptop, projecting a wall of legal citations behind Mackenzie for all to see. "In addition, under the Clean Water Act, certified organic farms have priority protection for groundwater resources." The room rippled with murmurs as residents processed the implications of that their perfectly manicured community could now be facing costly complications. Veronica's confidence had drained from her face, replaced by a pale tightness around the mouth. She kept glancing toward Mackenzie, as if willing him to make the federal regulations vanish. "This is absurd," she snapped at last, her composure cracking. "Mr. Vale, you can't just pull out some old document and expect it to override valid community concerns." But the commanding edge in her voice was gone, replaced by a shrill note of frustration. "Mrs. Slate," I said, gently closing my leather portfolio but keeping it visible on the table, "I'm sure you're skilled at what you do. But this land has been in my family for 3 generations, and my grandmother knew how to safeguard our rights." I tapped the certificate still in my hand. "She also left behind very specific water rights agreements, ones that stretch beyond my own property lines." The air in the room went still. In California, water rights weren't just about irrigation, they were about leverage, control, and the real balance of power in any land dispute. "You're bluffing," Veronica said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Even if you have water rights, they can't override development standards." I decided it was time to end the evening on my terms. "Well, Mrs. Slate," I said with a small smile, I suppose we'll find out next week when you and your fire marshal friends try to shut down my wine storage. Because I suspect that interfering with a federally protected agricultural site might require more permits than you currently have. The meeting dissolved into a mix of tense whispers and hurried note-taking. I gathered my papers, Sophie falling into step beside me. For several quiet days afterward, nothing happened long enough for me to almost believe she'd backed off. But early one morning, that illusion shattered. The sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled me from sleep, followed by the solid thud of car doors, the kind that carry official weight. Peering from my window, I spotted 3 police cruisers, a county fire marshal's truck, and Veronica's gleaming BMW lined up in my driveway like they were staging a parade. Lieutenant Parker stepped from the lead cruiser, a stocky man in his 40s with the easy swagger of small-town authority. 2 younger officers followed, both looking like they wished they were anywhere else. Fire Marshal Rodriguez emerged next, clutching a clipboard so thick it could double as a weapon. Finally, Veronica climbed out of her car wearing the smug smile of someone convinced they'd already won. I threw on my clothes, still tugging my boots on as Parker strode toward me holding a document. "Mr. Vale," he said formally. "Lieutenant Parker, Sonoma County Sheriff's Department. We're here to issue a notice of violation for unsafe storage conditions in your wine production facility." He motioned toward my storage barn, a sturdy structure my grandfather had built decades ago, one that had stood through storms, earthquakes, and every test California weather could throw at it without showing a single weak board. Fire Marshal Rodriguez has documented multiple safety hazards that present an immediate risk to the public, Parker continued. The construction dispute hung in the air, and I had to admit Mackenzie recovered faster than I expected. "Mr. Vale," he began smoothly, "federal agricultural designations may be significant, but they don't override local zoning laws or HOA covenant enforcement." His voice took on that condescending rhythm lawyers get when they assume they're talking to someone out of their depth. "The violations we've recorded deal with community standards and aesthetics, not farming practices." Even so, I caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. This wasn't the neat, cut-and-dry HOA case he probably handled on autopilot. The federal documents I carried weren't the kind of obstacle he could sweep aside with a standard speech. That's when Sophie stood, timing her move perfectly. Her training in law shone through in her posture and tone. "Mr. Mackenzie, you might want to refresh your memory on the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, specifically regarding federal agricultural statutes," she said, her voice laced with enough authority to make him hesitate. "When local rules clash with federal environmental protections, federal law takes precedence. And for the record, organic certification rules explicitly forbid the types of chemical treatments HOAs typically require for landscaping." She opened her laptop, projecting a wall of legal citations behind Mackenzie for all to see. "In addition, under the Clean Water Act, certified organic farms have priority protection for groundwater resources." The room rippled with murmurs as residents processed the implications of that their perfectly manicured community could now be facing costly complications. Veronica's confidence had drained from her face, replaced by a pale tightness around the mouth. She kept glancing toward Mackenzie, as if willing him to make the federal regulations vanish. "This is absurd," she snapped at last, her composure cracking. "Mr. Vale, you can't just pull out some old document and expect it to override valid community concerns." But the commanding edge in her voice was gone, replaced by a shrill note of frustration. "Mrs. Slate," I said, gently closing my leather portfolio but keeping it visible on the table, "I'm sure you're skilled at what you do. But this land has been in my family for 3 generations, and my grandmother knew how to safeguard our rights." I tapped the certificate still in my hand. "She also left behind very specific water rights agreements, ones that stretch beyond my own property lines." The air in the room went still. In California, water rights weren't just about irrigation, they were about leverage, control, and the real balance of power in any land dispute. "You're bluffing," Veronica said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Even if you have water rights, They can't override development standards. I decided it was time to end the evening on my terms. "Well, Mrs. Slate," I said with a small smile, "I suppose we'll find out next week when you and your fire marshal friends try to shut down my wine storage. Because I suspect that interfering with a federally protected agricultural site might require more permits than you currently have." The meeting dissolved into a mix of tense whispers and hurried note-taking. I gathered my papers, Sophie falling into step beside me. For several quiet days afterward, nothing happened long enough for me to almost believe she'd backed off. But early one morning, that illusion shattered. The sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled me from sleep, followed by the solid thud of car doors, the kind that carry official weight. Peering from my window, I spotted 3 police cruisers, a county fire marshal's truck, and Veronica's gleaming BMW lined up in my driveway like they were staging a parade. Lieutenant Parker stepped from the lead cruiser, a stocky man in his 40s with the easy swagger of small-town authority. 2 younger officers followed, both looking like they wished they were anywhere else. Fire Marshal Rodriguez emerged next, clutching a clipboard so thick it could double as a weapon. Finally, Veronica climbed out of her car wearing the smug smile of someone convinced they'd already won. I threw on my clothes, still tugging my boots on as Parker strode toward me holding a document. "Mr. Vale," he said formally, "Lieutenant Parker, Sonoma County Sheriff's Department. We're here to issue a notice of violation for unsafe storage conditions in your wine production facility." He motioned toward my storage barn, a sturdy structure my grandfather had built decades ago, one that had stood through storms, earthquakes, and every test California weather could throw at it without showing a single weak board. Fire Marshal Rodriguez has documented multiple safety hazards that present an immediate risk to the public, Parker continued. They had just threatened to cut off the water supply for half the county. "That's impossible," Veronica murmured, but the lack of conviction in her voice was impossible to miss. Lieutenant Parker was already retreating toward his cruiser, his radio spitting static and the clipped voice of Samionia, probably his supervisor, asking for an update. Fire Marshal Rodriguez didn't wait for instructions. He quietly wound his caution tape back into a neat roll and made for his truck like it was suddenly the most urgent place in the world. "Mrs. Slate," I said, locking eyes with her while Sophie's camera kept rolling for a rapidly growing online audience, "I think it's time you explain to these gentlemen your arrangement with Granite Peak Holdings. You know, the one where you've been selling property that isn't yours." The blood drained from her face as the realization hit her. Her perfectly choreographed intimidation stunt had just become a very public unveiling of what looked a lot like large-scale fraud. Later that afternoon, I found myself at my grandmother's old kitchen table, staring at a mountain of legal documents. 3 generations of history seemed to weigh down every page. The live stream had exploded, shared across countless local Facebook groups and picked up by a couple of regional news outlets, but the attention felt less like a win and more like a warning. Sophie had spent the morning juggling calls from reporters while I sat there trying to process the depth of what we were up against. The water rights were legitimate. The 51% ownership was real, but using them meant wading into a mess of legal and political entanglements that made any hoe skirmish seem like child's play. For the first time since this began, I found myself wondering if the smartest move would be to take whatever payout I could get and walk away. That's when I noticed the blinking red light on my grandmother's old landline answering machine as something I'd meant to unplug for months. I'd assumed it held nothing but dusty condolence messages from before she passed. But in that moment, I pressed play. Her voice filled the kitchen, warm and steady despite the static. "Ethan, sweetheart, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone here and you're probably figuring out that this farm isn't as simple as it looks." She laughed softly, and the sound hit me harder than I expected. "The land isn't just about grapes, honey. It's about water, about community, about making sure the right people hold the power over what matters. You'll be tempted to sell when it gets hard," she warned, "but there will always be people ready to buy you out." Make it sound easy to take the money and let them deal with the rest. Don't. This water system, this land, it's the backbone of everything we built, everything other families depend on. Without it, it all disappears. She went on, explaining the water rights, the community agreements, and the responsibility that came with them. Then, her voice firmed into a final charge. Fight for it, Ethan. Not just for us, but for everyone who calls this valley home. When the recording clicked off, my decision was made. Sophie appeared an hour later, arms full of county records and her laptop open like a detective's war room of spreadsheets, legal filings, and color-coded notes. Uncle Ethan, you have to see this, she said, barely able to contain her excitement. I've been tracing property transfers and development permits for the last 5 years. Veronica's entire HOA empire rests on some seriously shaky ground. She spun the laptop around to show a spider web of property sales, shell corporations, and development agreements, a high-stakes shell game. 3 months earlier, Veronica had filed to reclassify 8 agricultural properties for residential development, including my land, which she didn't even own. It got worse. Sophie had proof Veronica was selling development rights to Granite Peak Holdings for properties she couldn't control, raking in $8 million in so-called consulting fees for projects that couldn't legally proceed without water rights. The scheme was audacious, selling the same piece of land multiple times through front companies, banking on small owners being too afraid or too broke to fight. The real jaw-dropper came when Sophie pulled up emails between Veronica and Lieutenant Parker. They read less like citizen police correspondence and more like business planning. One stood out to a $50,000 transfer from one of Veronica's LLCs to Parker's personal account, labeled consultation services, conveniently dated right before enforcement pressure on my property began. It was all there, Veronica's legal maneuvering, Parker's muscle and badge, and a coordinated intimidation campaign. Uncle Ethan, Sophie said, her voice level now, this isn't HOA politics anymore. This is criminal fraud. We spent the rest of the day assembling evidence, a case file that could make a federal prosecutor grin. And Granite Peak, they had a track record of this exact kind of smear, leaving bankrupt neighborhoods and environmental wreckage in their wake. Granite Peak had perfected their tactics in other states before turning their attention to Sonoma County. Veronica became their local fixer, leveraging her legal background and deep ties within the HOA world to smooth the path for projects that mostly existed as filings and sales pitches rather than reality. The people she targeted were owners of modest family farms like mine, land worth enough to tempt developers, but held by folks without the resources for drawn-out court battles against corporations with bottomless pockets. By late afternoon, calls started pouring in from fellow Valley landowners who'd seen the live stream and were piecing together that they might be in the same crosshairs. Before the evening was over, a dozen families had committed to joining what Sophie had already named the Valley Defense Coalition. Each family brought their own fragments of Veronica's smear details that, when combined, showed just how meticulous her setup had been. We need to make this public, Sophie declared, uploading our evidence to a secure server and drafting press statements for the morning. Tomorrow's meeting isn't about a couple of HOA violations anymore, Uncle Ethan. Tomorrow we blow this whole thing open. The next day brought an unexpected twist. Instead of the community gathering we'd arranged, a notice arrived. Judge Helena Rodriguez of the Sonoma County Superior Court had ordered an emergency hearing to examine serious allegations of fraud and abuse of process affecting multiple property owners. It would be conducted by video link from the community center, open to all interested residents. By the time proceedings began, the same hall that had hosted Veronica's smug display days earlier was crammed with over 200 locals, 3 TV crews, and attention thick enough to taste. At exactly 10 a.m., Judge Rodriguez's face filled the large screen, of black robes, measured gaze, and an unmistakable air that she'd handled more than her share of messy property disputes. We are here to address allegations of fraudulent property transfers, misuse of HOA authority, and possible criminal conspiracy involving public officials, she said firmly, gesturing toward a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like the file Sophie and I had built the night before. "Mr. Vale, Mrs. Slate, Mr. Mackenzie, and Lieutenant Parker, you are all required participants in this hearing." In the front row, Veronica and Mackenzie looked like they'd each aged a decade overnight. Mackenzie fiddled with his paperwork. Veronica scrolled furiously on her phone, probably calculating how quickly she could shuffle assets offshore. At the back of the room, Parker shifted uneasily, sweat darkening his uniform as he eyed the exit. The residents murmured among themselves, many clutching printed copies of leaked property records and emails that had mysteriously appeared on the local Facebook group after midnight. "Mr. Mackenzie," Judge Rodriguez began, "please state your client's position regarding the liens and enforcement actions taken against the Vale property." Mackenzie launched into a rehearsed defense about HOA rights and neighborhood standards. He was only a few minutes in before the judge cut him off. "Counselor, are you aware your client filed property reclassification requests for land she does not own?" The silence that followed was crushing. Mackenzie faltered, looking back at Veronica, who stared at the judge as if she'd spoken in another language. Meanwhile, my phone lit up as Sophie's live stream had exploded from a few hundred viewers to more than 50,000. The comment feed a waterfall of gleeful outrage. "Your Honor," I said, rising with my grandmother's old portfolio in hand, "I have documents that may clarify Mrs. Slate's actual authority or lack thereof over these properties." For the next half hour, Judge Rodriguez dissected our evidence piece by piece. Emails between Veronica and Parker, bank transfers, property filings, it was all there, forming an unshakable case of years-long fraud. The room's energy shifted. Neighbors turned to glare at Veronica, who kept shrinking into her seat. Online, the viewership shot past 60,000, shared under headlines like "HOA bully gets destroyed in court" and "Watch this corrupt official crumble live." But the real turning point came when Judge Rodriguez fixed her gaze on Lieutenant Parker. "Officer," she said, "please explain your role in these enforcement actions." He stepped forward, cheeks flushed, the edges of panic already creeping in. Parker tried to frame his department's role as nothing more than standard backup for county code enforcement. He didn't get far. A second video feed appeared beside Judge Rodriguez's Police Chief Williams, his face carved into a look that said someone's career was about to be over. "Your Honor," Williams said, voice sharp enough to cut the air, "Lieutenant Parker had no authorization from this department to be involved in these enforcement actions." He let that hang for a beat before continuing, "Our internal review has uncovered serious financial discrepancies tied to Lieutenant Parker's activities. Effective immediately, he is suspended, pending criminal investigation." The crowd reacted like a struck beehive. Ear gasps, hurried whispers, and sideways glances. On the live stream, thousands of viewers pelted the comment feed with variations of "Oh snap" and "Boss just nuked him live." Judge Rodriguez wasn't done. She turned her attention to Veronica. "Mrs. Slate," she said evenly, "would you care to explain the $8 million you've accepted from Granite Peak Holdings in exchange for development rights you do not, in fact, control?" The question landed like a punch. Veronica's practiced calm shattered, her expression betraying the dawning awareness that every shady deal, every hidden payment, was now in daylight. "Those were legitimate consulting fees," she muttered, trying to summon authority and failing. That's when Sophie struck. She stepped forward, laptop open, a government seal filling the screen. "Your Honor," she announced, "Granite Peak Holdings was raided by federal agents yesterday morning. The FBI has identified it as a money laundering front tied to real estate fraud in 4 states. The online audience exploded. Veronica froze, then abruptly stood at her chair, clattering to the floor. "Fine," she snapped, voice pitching higher. "Yes, I took the money, a $2 million. Granite Peak promised me 5 times that if I delivered the water rights." Gasps swept the room. And then the venom came out. "Do you have any idea how impossible it is to push progress past a bunch of backward farmers clinging to the past?" she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of her own contempt. Mackenzie made a desperate grab to get her to sit down, but she plowed ahead, oblivious to his pleas. Parker was supposed to keep Vale in line. 50 grand to make sure there was no trouble. The lieutenant's head jerked toward her, eyes wide with disbelief, for he'd just been publicly accused of taking a bribe in front of a live audience numbering in the tens of thousands. The judge's gavel hammered against the desk, demanding order. "Mrs. Slate, you have the right to remain silent," Rodriguez said, her tone carrying the finality of someone who'd heard enough. "I strongly recommend you use it." Then she addressed the hall and the thousands watching online. "Based on the evidence and admissions made here today, I am ordering the immediate dissolution of the Silvercrest Hills HOA Board. A court-appointed receiver will oversee its affairs pending full investigation." The place erupted at cheers in the hall. Digital confetti in the live stream chat. The judge's next words only fueled it further. "This matter will be referred to the FBI and the State Attorney General for criminal prosecution." Moments later, federal marshals stepped into the room. They didn't waste time. Veronica and Parker were placed in cuffs and escorted out, while the audience count on Sophie's feed surged past 75,000. In the days that followed, the valley began to breathe again. The fog still rolled in every morning, but the air felt lighter. The weight of something ugly finally lifted. Standing on my grandmother's porch with coffee in hand, I looked out over the grapevines and marveled at the speed of change. The live stream of Veronica's collapse had been viewed over 2 million times, sparking reaction videos and turning what started as a land dispute into a national parable of local resistance against corporate fraud. Prosecutors moved quickly of federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, with a recommended sentence of 5 to 7 years. The FBI raids on Granite Peak offices in multiple states uncovered over $50 million in sham projects. Parker lost his badge and faced his own criminal case, ordered to return the full $50,000. Even Mackenzie wasn't spared, earning a suspension from the state bar for aiding in what the review board called ethically compromised enforcement actions. But the real victory came at the community level. The HOA was gone, restrictive covenants wiped out, and property rights restored to the owners. $2 million seized from Veronica's activities was placed into a community trust for agricultural preservation and water conservation. And perhaps most telling, the residents voted, unanimously, for new neighborhood standards that prioritized sustainability over cosmetic control. The new community embraced the rural character they had once resisted. Sophie's short-term break from a law school had transformed into a permanent calling. She opened a small law office in the restored barn behind my farmhouse, focusing on agricultural law and protecting the property rights of small farmers throughout Northern California. Her first big case involved helping 3 neighboring vineyard families recover development fees funneled into Veronica's shell companies. The victory spread her reputation quickly, and soon she was representing a steady stream of clients dealing with similar schemes. Over dinner one evening, she smiled and said, "Uncle Ethan, I think I've learned more about real law in the past month than I did in 3 years at Stanford." The water rights that had anchored our win turned out to be even more powerful than I'd imagined. For 3 generations, my family had held a controlling interest in the Soma Valley Water Management Company, never fully grasping its weight. The company managed water distribution for over 800 properties across 3 counties. With the 51% share my grandmother had left me, I held veto power over any major development impacting the watershed, or a safeguard against the kind of sprawling resorts and casinos that had gutted other communities. I didn't use that authority to block growth entirely. Instead, I partnered with the new local leadership to craft sustainable development guidelines protecting both farmland and measured, responsible housing. One of the most surprising turns came from Marcus Bennett, the bumbling safety inspector who had created Veronica's fabricated video. Just 2 weeks after her arrest, he arrived at my door with a handwritten apology and a request for honest work as a farm safety consultant. "Mr. Vale," he said, literally holding his hat in his hands, "I know I messed up bad with the video, but I really do know farm safety systems. I only took her money because I needed it. I didn't hire him, but I did connect him with a reputable poultry operation in the next county, of people who valued hard work and paid for it honestly. As autumn came and harvest season filled the valley with energy, our transformation felt complete. Former Silvercrest Hills residents now fully embraced their place in an agricultural preserve. Some began planting organic gardens, while others replaced manicured lawns with native plants that attracted wildlife. The Community Trust Fund had already backed 3 major projects: a solar-powered irrigation upgrade for 6 farms, a wetland restoration improving water quality, and an educational program bringing urban schoolchildren to learn about sustainable farming. On a crisp October morning, Sophie joined me on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee and a folder of legal documents for our latest water conservation plan. "Uncle Ethan," she asked, settling into my grandmother's old rocking chair, "did you know from the start that you'd win?" I let the question hang as I looked across the vineyard, mistrizing to reveal rows of thriving grapevines. Pulling out my phone, I played the voicemail that had changed everything, my great-grandmother Margaret Vale's voice, strong and steady. "The land doesn't lie, Ethan. People lie, corporations lie, politicians lie, but the land will always tell you exactly what it is and what it needs. When you truly listen, you'll understand that real power isn't about controlling others, so it's about knowing your place in something bigger than yourself." As her words faded into the morning air, I gazed over 70 acres of healthy soil, clean water, and sustainable crops that would endure long after we were gone. "That's the truth, Sophie," I said quietly. "Real power isn't the loudest voice in the room, it's knowing your rights, honoring your responsibilities, and refusing to let anyone's greed outweigh your community's future. Knowledge is the sharpest weapon against corruption. When you understand your rights and stand your ground, even the most elaborate scams crumble. The truth always wins if you're ready to fight for it." Subscribe to Anna Drama Nest for more stories of justice served, clever turnarounds, and bullies meeting their match. Whether you laugh, gasp, or shake your head, thanks for staying until the end. The Anna Drama Nest team is proud to deliver every story with a little extra spicy. Just watch out, because Kling and Karen might still try to steal your spotlight.